The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
Thank you, Muffy. That was very, very gracious and thoughtful. You're very kind for conveying all that information about our respective companies and a little bit about me, most of which I think was true, as far as I know. As Muffy points out, Cargill is one of our company's largest and most loyal flat-rolled products customers. My good friend Mike Taylor, president of the Cargill Service Center Group, is here. I think over 300,000 tons last year, Mike. Think about that, 300,000 tons, almost all of which, by the way, started out as some rocks up north of here that I'll get to in just a moment. Mike and his colleagues who are here are great friends, and we work with them very carefully over the years. They exemplify, I think, the kind of people that one encounters at Cargill in every way. They're all outstanding, intelligent, wonderful people. My only question is, they've heard me speak before, so why in the world are they here? I just can't quite figure that part out, but that's a little bit of a concern. We do supply lots of steel, and Mike and his team work well with my colleagues, and we are right now being supplied with natural gas to a number of our facilities through the Cargill system, including up here in northern Minnesota. So it's very, very nice to have this chance to be with my friends from Cargill. So I'd like to thank you, Muffy, and to everyone for our great relationship, and thanks to ARC and the folks from the Chamber, really everyone else, for the chance to be here. The Economic Club of Minnesota is a terrific organization, great honor for me and more so for our company for a chance for me to be here and to give a few comments to this group. My comments today will focus on a number of things, mostly on the link between one of Minnesota's most important natural resources, iron ore, you may not always think of it here in the Twin Cities, and steel, which is what we do for a living, and what that link means to U.S. Steel, and more importantly, I think, to all Minnesotans. From the residents up on the Mesabi Iron Range, including our company's more than 1,800 employees, to the people and businesses all around the state, including right here in the Twin Cities, iron ore and steel have important roles to play in helping American manufacturers compete in the global economy. By the way, I was supposed to have some slides. Aaron, where are we? Do I have slides, actually? Oh, they're up. Okay, good. They're going to switch them automatically, I hope, Aaron. Is that the plan? Okay, great, good. For a minute, I thought, as usual, I made a big mistake. Now, when you think of United States Steel Corporation, when you think of our company, Minnesota may not be the first place that comes to mind. You may well think of Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh, our corporate headquarters city, and where our company started making steel back in Carnegie's day. Muffy, thank you for that reference back to our long ago beginnings. After today, I hope that when you hear of U.S. Steel, you might think of Minnesota first, because our operations here is where it starts for us. Our operations supply most of our North American requirements for iron ore, the raw material that's at the beginning, the center, the heart of the steelmaking process. This gives our company a big advantage in a very, very competitive global steel industry. Without our company's Minnesota iron ore reserves, some of which date from John D. Rockefeller's 1894 purchase of a Mesabi Iron Range company, U.S. Steel would be likely a very, very different company today, if indeed we were a company at all. That's how important this has been to us over the years. So, what does U.S. Steel look like today? We operate facilities and have joint ventures in 5 countries. You can see in the U.S. from in Minnesota down through the Midwest into the South. We employ about 38,000 people, annual revenues on the order of $20 billion, modest-sized company in today's world. Now, according to the World Steel Association, our trade group, the latest figures we see represent us as the 13th largest steel company in the world, about 30 million tons of raw steelmaking capability. We remain the largest integrated steel producer here in the U.S., and we're also the largest integrated tubular products manufacturer in North America. While the economic recovery process has been a long and difficult one for our company, one fundamental value remains unchanged, and it gives us some cause for optimism about the future. Steel is essential to building, maintaining and advancing a modern society. Steel is a truly amazing modern material, both in terms of its capabilities and its possibilities. Every batch of steel is metallurgically designed to meet our customers' particular needs, and those products are then transformed by our customers into things that touch your daily lives: automobiles and trucks, food cans, household appliances, energy pipelines, and the kinds of heavy industrial equipment we use every day at our Minnesota ore operations. That leads me back to my earlier point about U.S. Steel having our own reserves of iron ore supplied largely by our facilities here in Minnesota. Some of that supply comes from our ownership interest in Hibbing Taconite, a joint venture operation with Cliffs Natural Resources and ArcelorMittal. But the majority of our iron ore is supplied by two facilities in this state we collectively call Minnesota Ore Operations, a name we think, by the way, which is quite clever. It gets better. Now, consisting of Mintac, which you might guess stands for Minnesota Taconite, in mountain iron, and Keetac, cleverly derived from Keewatin Taconite, U.S. Steel's Minnesota Ore Operations in North America is North America's largest producer of iron ore pellets, the key ingredient used to make steel in the integrated blast furnace steelmaking process that our company employs. We've been mining iron ore in Minnesota for more than a century. As I mentioned, Rockefeller's Mesabi Range Holdings began supplying Andrew Carnegie's Pittsburgh area steel mills back in the late 1800s. When U.S. Steel was formed in 1901 as the world's first billion-dollar company, the inclusion of Rockefeller's iron ore company and the related reserves were a key part of the transaction. And in fact, he was one of the major shareholders of U.S. Steel at our foundation. He and Carnegie didn't much like each other, just as an aside. Carnegie took to referring to him in polite company as Rockefello, but they were not very good friends. Mining technologies and processes have changed a lot during our history here in Minnesota. For many decades, from the early days, miners quite easily extracted high-grade ore deposits from the surface and sent them directly to steel plants like ours. At the time the 1940s rolled around, the high-grade deposits were rapidly depleting after years of very high production in steel to meet our nation's wartime and post-war consumer demand. So it became quite apparent that America's long-term iron ore needs would have to be met in some different way. Companies like ours knew well that the Iron Range had abundant reserves of an iron-bearing rock called taconite, because we had been around for a long time and had to dispose of things like that in the mining process. So what we had to do was to figure out how to extract the iron scattered throughout the taconite like specks of pepper and create a concentrated form that blast furnaces could process. And we needed this yet-to-be-discovered process to be economically viable. So we forged ahead with some cautious optimism, and many companies, including U.S. Steel, invested quite a bit of money, millions in those days, in research and development right here in Minnesota. We opened Pilot Tech, another really clever name, the pilot version of Mintac in 1953. After determining that the process would work, and if we did it right, it could be economically feasible, we went on a full-scale commercial taconite plant in what is now Mintac. Began operations in the mid-1960s. Keetac followed along a little bit later in 1967 and was built by a predecessor company that we acquired in 2003, National Steel Corporation. It was a bit of a throw-in at the time, I have to confess, as I was negotiating that transaction. These days, I say, of course, it was a strategic master stroke. Don't tell anybody. Together, these two sites, just to give a few numbers, cover more than 60,000 acres in northeastern Minnesota. Mintac is 9 miles long, equal to the distance between, I'm told, the Xcel Energy Center and the Metrodome, just to give you some sense of the scale of our one mining operation. It's 1.5 miles wide and in most places 250 feet deep. Keetac is 4.5 miles long, 1 mile wide, and 300 feet deep. Annually, Keetac and Mintac can produce about 22 million tons combined of iron ore pellets, 22 million tons. Keep in mind, to come out with 22 million tons, we had to go in with raw ore and then move back out about 100 million tons. That's what my colleague Tom Kelly, give us a wave, Tom, I introduced you before. Tom's our general manager of our Mintech operations. If anything really serious comes up, he'll answer it for us. On average, our two facilities process about 200,000 tons of crude ore each day. That's enough material to fill a line of half-ton pickup trucks that are bumper to bumper from Minneapolis, can you guess, to New York City, and back about 1/3 of the way, every day of the year. That's how much we process, every day, 24/7, regardless of the weather. And keep in mind that those pickup trucks would be made with a substantial amount of steel, and most of that steel would have started off as the very material they would have been carrying. Isn't that justice? Now, your tables, and not for home use, we have provided each of you with small samples of the materials that comprise the three key stages of today's iron ore production process. I hope they weren't mistaken for some type of exotic seasoning for your luncheon, so hopefully you still have them. You can see from the basic iron-bearing rock that we start with to the pepper-like substance that we extract from the rock using powerful magnets, to the high-content iron ore pellets that leave our Minnesota operations bound for our steelmaking facilities throughout North America. So how important, and by the way, I think it starts at anywhere between 15 and 30% probably iron concentration in the raw ore, and the pellets should be 65%. Tom, last time I checked, was that the target? 65% iron with some material in them that allows the furnaces to work more efficiently in terms of dolomite and iron reduction in the blast furnaces. So how important is Minnesota to the North American steel sector? Mines in Minnesota produce about 2/3 of the iron ore used to make blast furnace produced steel in the U.S. today, and our Minnesota ore operations contribute about half of that amount. So what does that mean for the economy here in Minnesota? A new report from the University of Minnesota Duluth on the economic impact of mining indicates that more than 11,000 people are directly employed in iron mining activities in Minnesota. Iron mining directly contributed $1.9 billion in wages, rents, interest, profits in 2011, and almost $152 million in Minnesota taxes. Furthermore, nearly 1/3 of the gross regional product of Northeast Minnesota is mining related, compared to tourism at 11% and I understand forestry at 10%. I understand that there's more information from the study outlining the full impact of mining in Minnesota, and that study will be released next week sometime. Should also note that Minnesota's Department of Natural Resources recently reported that state mineral revenue related to mining set an all-time record of $51 million in 2012, and 97% of that revenue came from iron ore production. As you can see, our company's operations alone employ more than 1,800 people. We also expend hundreds of millions of dollars in payroll, employee and retiree benefits, taxes, payments to vendors, many of whom I'm pleased to note are represented in this room that have long worked with our company and have great relationships, and other donations and the like. But all of us here know that numbers alone cannot and should not tell any company's entire story. We take our obligations as a corporate citizen very seriously. We always have. Our first chairman, Judge Elbert Gary, believed in doing business based on standards of openness, decency, community involvement, and responsible performance. Those were all relatively unheard of concepts in corporate America in his day, more than a century ago. He was a driving force behind our company becoming the first in our country to issue an annual report. We were the first to conduct an annual meeting of stockholders and the first to establish a code of business ethics. That code, known as the Gary Principles, still serves as our company's guide today, providing a framework for our commitment to employee safety, our shared environment, and the communities where we operate. 9 principles, we have them in, I think, at this point, 5 or 6 languages. Everyone in the company knows what they are. One I'll just off the top of my head comment on. Judge Gary said that if we are to succeed in business, we must do so on principles that are honest, fair, lawful, and just. You know, if everybody was taught that in school, that might go some ways towards getting us all on the right track. Judge Gary had it right more than 100 years ago. I'll speak in a little bit more about some safety and environmental matters in a moment, but I want to note now that our employees and our surroundings strongly influence U.S. Steel when it comes to our investments in Minnesota. For instance, we have a very highly skilled and experienced, dedicated workforce, some of whom were third, maybe even fourth generations of their families to work at our facilities. Our mining operations utilize state-of-the-art technology and equipment that requires specialized education and training, and we anticipate those training needs will only continue to grow, and the commitment of some local organizations, including the Chamber, to education and training, I think, is well thought out. So we work with regional high schools, a number of technical colleges, tribal colleges, universities in Minnesota to ensure that today's students have the skills and knowledge they need to become employees in our industry. I was explaining to someone during the reception that we had our board meeting in Tech and KeyTech both in September, and courtesy of our friends at Caterpillar and Ziegler had some terrific new equipment on display. Had just been delivered, still had the new truck smell, this big, huge 300-ton haul truck. And as we climbed up and looked in that truck, there's no possible way me with just a 4-year degree in accounting could have possibly operated that equipment. It is very complicated, and our people who are trained to do that, most of whom are represented steelworker labor, are really talented, dedicated, smart people, and we're very, very proud to have them, and we really worry and are concerned about being able to keep that kind of dedicated, smart person in our workforce. Our technology investments have enabled Mintac and KeyTech to recycle about 95% of the water we use back into our operations, 95%. We have a partnership with our good friends and colleagues from Minnesota Power to provide renewable energy from the first commercial wind center in northeastern Minnesota, Taconite Ridge. I'm told fast becoming a tourist attraction as well. It's located on U.S. Steel property. They're enormous facilities and lots of steel, which we're pleased to see, by the way. We've also installed innovative systems such as seep collection to mitigate discharges, low nitrogen oxide or NOx burners to reduce emissions. We're trying to be an environmental leader in the taconite industry. In addition, more than 10,000 acres of KeyTech's property are enrolled in a sustainable forest management program for large private landowners in Minnesota. Not to mention, you might have heard about a proposed expansion at KeyTech, which would increase our pellet production capability, create jobs both in construction and permanent, and reduce emissions. Project currently on hold as we take a look at what the business conditions are and some proposed regulatory standards that would be relevant to the project. We look forward to continuing the conversation about the project, and we appreciate the support we've received from the Iron Range Legislative Delegation. They've been terrific, Governor Dayton, and many others in Minnesota, including several people here in this room today. Now, even as we invest in Minnesota, U.S. Steel as a company must think globally, as the iron ore and steel markets are both highly competitive and integrated. Clearly, the steel and iron ore markets are interconnected, since about 70% of the more than 1.5 billion metric tons of steel produced each year, 1.5 billion tons of steel produced, 70% are manufactured using the integrated or blast furnace process, a process that begins with iron ore in one form or another. But it's important to distinguish between them in order to understand the position of the American steel industry today. The iron ore market, very concentrated, about 2/3 of the world's iron ore export market, supplied by the top 3 or 4 producers based in Australia and Brazil. In contrast, the global steelmaking market, very fragmented among many producers, hundreds all around the world. From the mid-90s to the middle of the last decade, the margins in both markets were slim by any measure. By 2004, iron ore and steel producers' margins expanded as demand exceeded supply in both sectors, largely driven by the extraordinary expansion of demand in China. Greater demand for iron ore led to several developments in recent years: much higher prices, much greater price volatility, production cost increases, and Chinese expansion of its own domestic ore mining capacity, and even export restrictions on iron ore in certain countries, largely India, to name just a few. This more recent situation of tight supply and rising prices allowed the ore producers to use their market concentration to take a larger share of the value of the end product, finished steel. between materials and steel, a certain amount of value created, the miners began to take a much, much bigger piece of that pie. Integrated steelmakers like U.S. Steel have an advantage in these circumstances to the extent we have our own iron ore mining operations, which of course we do. Thus, we're able to retain the iron ore portion of that value chain and reduce operating cost volatility and avoid becoming nothing more than a converter of other people's raw materials, with the value going to them and our value being squeezed because they're taking a bigger piece of the pie. But recent trends are still very difficult for our sector and for our company, and we have to stay on our toes. From what the World Steel people tell us, worldwide steel production in 2012 increased just slightly, about 1.2% compared to 2011. Much lower than the 6.2% improvement back in 11 versus 10. World Steel also cites a sharper than expected slowdown of the Chinese economy. I think we all know that. It's had an effect on many of us, as well as a lot of uncertainties created by the Eurozone debt crisis and our own fiscal instability here in our country. On the iron ore supplier side, several of the large producers have tried to balance decision-making around these lengthy, capital-intensive development projects for new mining capability, 5, 10, $15 billion, 5, 7 years easily, against market conditions that change so rapidly. In the last year, Mike, or maybe Jeff or someone would know better than I would, but I think the internationally traded iron ore price iron ore fines landed in China, it's probably gone from over 150 to a little less than 90 to today 150, 147, Mike, something like that. That's the volatility that they've looked at to decide whether, yes, we should do a $7 billion project that'll take 5 years. So you can be happy, not so sure, or really sad, depending on what day it was, if you have one of those projects underway. This is just an observation. I don't mean to be catty about it, but I think if you take the top 5 or 6 miners, predominantly ferrous miners, I think they all have or are looking for new CEOs. And they all made big bets, and it didn't work out so well, as it turns out. So the link between iron ore and steel is an interesting one. Let me just touch on another piece of it. There's some new technology that we're all interested in called direct reduced iron technology. Without getting into all the technical stuff, because I'm not a technician, direct reduced iron, DRI, is a process that allows steelmakers like us to produce high-quality iron for steelmaking without the need for coke, which is derived from metallurgical coal, which is a really expensive, capital-intensive, environmentally messy process that people like me hate, but we have to have. So DRI allows you to take iron ore and go through the reduction process to take off the volatiles and come out with pure iron using natural gas as your reductants, not the pure carbon which is derived from coke. That technology has been around for decades. It's in use in many other territories around the world, several hundred probably installations, I would think, at last count. It's not been used in the U.S. Or North America much because natural gas was either unstable, volatile, not available, or just too expensive. It takes about 10 M's per unit. 10 M's per unit at $3 or $4, way different than 10 M's at $8. And this technology, with today's iron ore technology, is very, very competitive and allows the capital cost of new installations to be cut way, way back, get completely out of the coal and coke business. It's something that's quite exciting for us, and we're studying it. There's a few plants already underway in North America. We're not quite there yet, but probably something we want to get into our footprint eventually. This energy sector development, by the way, has changed a lot of things for us. For us, of course, we're the largest producer of pipe in North America, so it's been a great thing from us from a market standpoint. But also to the extent we use large amounts of gas. I think last year 130 MMBTUs, 130 million MMBTUs. You know, $1 for us is $130 million. So if you decide, do you like $8 gas better than $4, you can make that calculation. I'm not good with numbers, but I think, you know, 4 looks better than 8 from our standpoint. Now, again, I think the safe and environmentally responsible development of this new energy wealth that's been discovered through technology and entrepreneurship and ingenuity, including gas and oil both, has the potential to be transformative for our economy. It's huge for us and others that are more on the heavy industrial side of things, but eventually it'll work its way through the entire economy, I think. And long sought after, but really not realistic objective of energy independence, or at least energy stability, probably is in front of us if we do it right as a country and if we do it right from a policy standpoint. It's really important to us. We're using gas to limit the amount of coke and coal we have to use. It's been an outstanding cost savings for us. Hundreds of millions of dollars would be the nature of the savings we have. As I said, also for our two-meter operation, which has been great for us from an operating profit standpoint. But one thing we are concerned about, of course, is that the development be responsible, but be allowed to continue. And we're concerned about public policy there. We want to make sure that in some zealous means to try to control the situation, that the entrepreneurship and the technology that's been unleashed to develop natural gas and oil at levels no one thought possible in our country is not squelched or squandered, and we think that's a concern. And so from a public policy standpoint, we advocate quite a bit for our energy development. It has to be responsible, but it should be allowed to continue. That's our basic position. We also think that there are just a few things that the policymakers, from our perspective, should focus on. And one of them is international trade, something that concerns us occasionally. When competition and trade are fair and new investment and job creation happens, everyone wins. It's good for everybody, good for our country, good for the countries that we trade with. And most of our product, much of it, 30, 40, 50% crosses the border to get to its destination. So we're okay with trade. We have no problem with trade. What we're not okay with is trade that is unfair, illegal, dumped, subsidized. It has an effect on our market, on our employees, on our communities, on people that we all know that live up the road here in northeastern Minnesota. So we think with a reliable, competitive energy supply, assurance that trade laws get enforced, that manufacturers like our company will have some confidence to reinvest in our facilities and build new facilities, create jobs, keep in mind the kind of jobs we create, many of you do, that pay family-sustaining wages, provide good benefits, support communities across our nation, not in Washington, D.C. necessarily, not in New York or Los Angeles, but in places like Lorain, Ohio, Clairton, Pennsylvania, Granite City, Illinois, and Keewatin and Martin Iron, Minnesota. That's where our people are, and we're very glad to have them there. Now, mentioned that steel has been, will continue to be a very important part of our society and economy. Historically, iron ore-based steels were key components of the warships and artillery and ammunition and vehicles that were used to defend our nation. Iron ore-based steel also has served as the foundation for the development of our nation's infrastructure, starting in the latter part of the 1800s. Development of skylines, as you all see, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, that was all steel, much of it we made, some of which our construction company actually built. Today, we continue to be surrounded by buildings, vehicles, and so many other things that are made of steel. Furthermore, steel made specifically from iron ore continues to be a critical part of many of the applications that require really exacting metallurgical composition that only our form of production, iron ore-based, can provide. Scrap-based steelmaking has grown in this country over the past 40 years. It's now the majority of steel that's actually made. Has an important place in our industry. We use lots of scrap as well. Steel, by the way, is the most recycled of all modern materials of all time by far. If you take the sum of glass, modern materials, glass, plastic, aluminum, paper, add them all up, times 4, steel is beyond that. That's how much steel recycling goes on. Not because someone told us we don't put it out at the curb at night. It's because, you can, but it's really because the economics of recycling steel are so good. And steel doesn't know where it came from and doesn't care where it goes. A car turns into a can, a bridge turns into an air conditioner, a water heater turns into some shelving somewhere. It doesn't matter where it came from or where it goes. It's universally recyclable. In fact, if you think about it, almost all the steel that's ever been manufactured in North America is still in use today. There's hardly any in a landfill. If it's there, it's by accident. Steel, once it's made, stays with us and continues to contribute to modern society. But only steel made directly from iron ore can fill the needs of certain end-use products. For example, automotive body panels and tin-plated food cans need very highly formable steel with really important surface quality attributes. Scrap, which contains some residual elements, copper and nickel and the like, would make the steel less formable, perhaps the surface quality less even. And since steel made in our method from iron ore doesn't contain those residuals, really only it meets the needs of automotive and tin plate can manufacturers. And that's why those are two of our top markets. And our customers require that sort of steel. We require the iron ore that we mine up in Minnesota to do that. And that brings it full circle. We think what we do here in Minnesota is vital to American manufacturing. Now, for this reason, being a good corporate citizen and operating our mining facilities in a responsible manner, critical to our company. We understand that's part of the deal, part of our license to operate in our country and in the great state of Minnesota. This is something that we don't undertake alone. We value the relationships we have, again, a lot here in this room, and others who have helped us ensure that we're doing this the right way. One of those relationships I want to point out is with the United Steelworkers. I understand that the leaders couldn't be here today. They're at a meeting in Pittsburgh, but I want to take a moment to recognize the USW and their leadership and membership for their cooperation and hard work on matters related to corporate citizenship. They're really good to work with. We have, I think, a reasonable continuity of view on things that are important for the company, for the union, for the employees, the communities. We get along well, and we try to advance the cause of the company and not let other things that might distract us or detract us from our mission to get in the way. President Gerard and I are of the same mind of that. I think we try to deal with matters of consequence with us. Anything that could result in the slightest degree of difficulty or work, we leave to someone else. We found that to be probably the best way to do things. We think that's a good example of leadership. Now, just a couple comments on safety and environmental stewardship. An area where our company and the USW focus a lot of attention every day is on employee safety. We have in our facilities virtually every industrial hazard ever discovered by man, so we have plenty of challenges in that area. But in my view, there's no better strategy for global business success than an uncompromising commitment to our employee safety, and that's what we have. That's why safety is our most critical core value. And thanks to the hard work and dedication of our entire workforce, 38,000 people, 80 million man-hours last year, 24/7, the last 2 years have been the safest in U.S. Steel's 111 or now 112-year history from a statistical standpoint. And Mintac and Keetac have been terrific contributors to that accomplishment. Keetac, Tom, how many? 3 years without a lost time? You imagine that? 3 years doing what we do at Keetac with blowing things up and big trucks and crushers and facilities like that. 3 years without a lost time incident at Keetac. It's a great accomplishment. In 2005, in our company, we had 105 serious incidents, 31 days or more away from work. 105, 31 or more days away from work. So that's someone who's injured. 31 more days, that's something serious. There's no mistake about it. 31, or 105, 31 more days away. 2012 was our best year ever. We had a very good year. We worked on this. We've had good success since 2005. You might wonder what that means, good success. You're probably thinking 75, 65, 50. 6. Went from 105 to 6. So if you add all those up, if we'd have stayed at 105, 1,000 people, somebody that we would know, would have been injured seriously enough to be away from work 31 days or more. We think that's something that's worth working on. And by the way, when you take that through the whole company, which means everybody has to come to work every day doing things the right way, cost, quality, reliability, it all sort of falls in line. So we don't think there's any possibility that one has to trade between safety and performance. We think safety leads performance. That's how we run the company. We've had all sorts of awards. One up in Keetac just recently, the Sentinels of Safety Award, co-sponsored by the National Mining Association, the U.S. Department of Labor. It's a great award. Awards are good, but our objective really is to get to zero, and that's what people like Tom and the folks at Keetac have been able to achieve, an extraordinary achievement. Now, like safety, environmental stewardship, another important core value of our company, integral part of how we do our business every day, including our Minnesota ore operations right here close to home. After all, the future of the range, where the steel begins, relies on us preserving and caring for this beautiful natural environment. And I mean that sincerely. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful place. We love being there. The U.S. has some of the cleanest running industrial technology in the world. In Minnesota, with the lakes and the acres of forest and all the things that we love, has some of the most stringent environmental requirements. That's probably okay. Minnesota is a really, really nice place. I always say that we don't need the rules that they have in China for Minnesota, because Minnesota is way better than China. We need to have rules that want to keep Minnesota like Minnesota. So we're okay with that. We think that's the way the world should be. Now, at the same time, though, we need to invest millions of dollars each year to try to keep our ecological footprint where it should be. Since back in the early part of 2 decades ago, 1990, the steel industry in the U.S. has reduced our CO2 emissions per ton of steel produced by about 1/3. 27% reduction on a voluntary basis, by the way. No one told us to. It was a good business. We reduced our CO2 emissions by about 1/3. In Europe, where we operate, where they have a system for cap and trade, emissions have gone up. I'll let you judge what system works best, whether it's business and incentives or command and control. You can judge which works best. We work closely with government agencies and other stakeholders, there are quite a few, in our operations throughout North America to ensure that we're on the right side of all the air, water, and waste. Things like land management, reclamation, we try to make sure we stay on the right side of that, really try to stay in front of it. We work with our steel association groups, U.S. and world, to try to make sure we're working on the right new technologies that someday may make steel a different way that wouldn't need carbon. It would be great if we could figure it out. It's going to be a long way, but we still work on it. And as I said, we understand the importance of the environment we all share here, particularly in areas like Minnesota. The areas you refer to as up north, where our facilities are located and where our people live and work, and many of you would play as well. So to that end, we try to maintain at our operating groups very open dialogue up north with the Native American tribal leaders, environmental interest groups, others who share our dedication to the people and resources of the range. In support of our company's ongoing environmental efforts in this state, I met with Governor Dayton and the Iron Range delegation earlier today to really thank them for their ongoing commitment to the health of the steel and iron ore industries, and also to look forward to our collective continued cooperation and conversations about improving the environmental review and permitting process here in Minnesota. And we're fine with reasonable and responsible environmental standards and regulation. There's no problem with that whatsoever. We'd like there to be some reasonable balance and objective approach to making sure that we can get through that in a reasonable period of time so that when we look to invest, and everything we invest in is hundreds of millions of dollars usually, we'd like to have some sense as to what the timeline is and what the eventual outcome might be. So we're pleased that the Dayton administration has, and the legislature both have implemented a number of advancements that we can build on going into 2013. So important subject, but I think we're pleased that certainly the issue has been recognized. Now I tell you all this because I want to be clear that U.S. Steel understands. We're okay with the regulation, but we think there should be some balance, and we hope others do too. We mine iron ore where the deposits are located. We didn't put them there, that just happens to be where they are. We can't move them away very easily, and it happens to be right in the middle of a beautiful place, but we think we can do that in a way that doesn't cause any serious issues. Doing things right by Minnesota economically. We employ thousands of people, directly and indirectly, to mine and process the ore to make the steel that is competitive in the global market. Doing right by Minnesota environmentally. We focus on stewardship and responsibility. And doing right by Minnesota communities' employees, we make safety our highest priority, while also stressing outreach and transparency. Of course, the state and federal governments play key roles in all this as well. I think they too need to consider the balance between economy and the environment. They have very complex considerations that political leaders do. I know taxes, utility rates, all those sort of things are difficult. We just hope that they understand the position that we are in as they consider some of the implications of their decisions. But we look at a lot of decisions when we make, a lot of issues when we make big investment decisions. Regulatory costs are one of them. So again, we support common sense regulations, state, federal governments, and we also encourage them to work together, by the way, which has not always been the case here in the great state of Minnesota. We think we need to have them consider scientifically, geology, topography, hydrology, all issues which we need to consider, air quality, of course. But as a company doing business in a really competitive, wicked, vicious global industry, and we tend to go to states and territories and regions where things are reasonable, balanced, predictable, and we've got some expectation that if we kick off a $250 million investment, which almost everything we do is $250 million, a water cooler is $250 million for us, it seems. Then when we kick that off, even though we know the market's going to be up and down, left and right, that at some point we've got some visibility as to when we're done, do we have a shot at earning some kind of a return. So we encouraged today, and we'll continue to encourage state and federal leaders to join us in advocating for regulations strong and reasonable so that companies like us, states like Minnesota, can remain hubs for innovative manufacturing companies, and we might include ourselves in that list. So just to finish up, I'm pleased to announce an important new initiative that U.S. Steel is undertaking with our United Steelworkers colleagues. We call the new endeavor the Iron Ore Alliance. We're working to build some better awareness and understanding of the issues affecting the iron ore industry here in Minnesota. Together, we plan to engage stakeholder groups in conversations about future opportunities in Minnesota, how they can be actively involved in the decision-making process. We'll work with the USW through the Iron Ore Alliance, and we're committed to doing everything we can to position Mintech and Keytech for continued growth and job creation for our employees directly and for a lot of other companies who we work with throughout the process. It's good for U.S. Steel, we think humbly that it's good for Minnesota employees, and we think it's good for the state. It's my colleague, Chris Paciantonio, who's here. Where are you, Chris? Give us a wave. Chris is over here. He'll be representing us. He's responsible for our state government affairs work, together with Bob Radulich, Director of USW District 11, headquartered here in Minneapolis, former Mintech employee. They're going to co-chair that new alliance initiative. You may hear something about them and their process as time goes on. So, thank you again to the Economic Club of Minnesota for having me here today. I hope you've enjoyed some of these stories that and yarns that I've spun for you. I'll summarize for you what I told the delegation at the range and the governor and a few others today, that what we're about in Minnesota, what we want to do is to mine, to employ, and to invest. And we would like to do that in a way that's good for us and also good for Minnesota. Thank you all for having me.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.